Less than 60 minutes remained until my execution when the heavy steel slot of my cell door slid open. Warden Miller didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with confusion. He was a man who had presided over a dozen state-sanctioned deaths, but my final request had unsettled him. I hadn't asked for a stake, a priest, or a final call to a distant relative. I had asked for him, Willie L. Ford. The name alone made the warden's hand shake as he signaled the guards to begin the transfer. 20 minutes later, I wasn't led to the execution chamber, but into a dimly lit, formal office tucked away in the prison's administrative wing. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and old leather, completely out of place in this house of concrete. Behind a massive wooden desk sat an older man in a dark, tailored suit, his gray hair silvered by the desk lamp. Willie L. Ford leaned forward, his eyes cold and judging, flanked by two muscular bodyguards who stood like stone statues. I stood at the center of the room in my orange jumpsuit, my hands restrained and my face tear-streaked, feeling the weight of the massive gates closing behind me. I knew why he was here, not for mercy, but to see the face of the girl who had dared to summon the king of the city to her deathbed. The clock on the cinderblock wall of my cell didn't tick. It pulsed, a rhythmic throb that felt like a countdown toward the end of the world. Less than 60 minutes remained until the state of Ohio planned to stop my heart. Yet the air in the room had suddenly changed. The heavy steel slot of my door slid open with a jarring metallic screech. But it wasn't the chaplain or the executioner who stood on the other side. It was Warden Miller. He was a man who had presided over a dozen state-sanctioned deaths. His face usually a mask of bureaucratic indifference, but today that mask was cracked. He looked at me not with the usual pity reserved for the condemned, but with a profound, agitated confusion. My final request had unsettled him to his core. I hadn't asked for a final meal of steak and lobster, nor had I requested a final phone call to a distant relative or a priest to shrive my soul. I had looked him in the eye and demanded an audience with Willie L. Ford. The name alone made the warden's hand shake as he gripped the edge of the door. To the world, Ford was a ghost, a titan of the criminal underworld who moved in the shadows of the city's skyline. To the law, he was the king of the mafia. Requesting him was like asking for a meeting with a hurricane. "You're sure about this, Carol?" Miller asked, his voice low, almost a whisper as if the walls themselves might report the name to the governor. "This isn't a legal maneuver. This isn't a stay." "I don't want a stay from the state," I replied, my voice raspy from days of silence but steady with a sudden, sharp purpose. "I want him." Miller lingered for a second, his heavy eyes searching my tear-streaked face for a sign of madness, but he found only a cold, desperate clarity. He signaled to the two guards waiting in the hall, and for the first time in 7 years, I was led away from the direction of the execution chamber. My orange jumpsuit felt like a weight of lead against my skin, the fabric rough and smelling of industrial detergent, a stark contrast to the life I was about to fight for. The walk through the prison was a blur of gray concrete and the rhythmic clanking of my leg irons against the floor. Every inmate we passed seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The usual jeers and shouts were replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. We didn't head for the courtyard or the visiting room. Instead, I was guided into the administrative wing, through a series of heavy gates that creaked open with a groan of protesting metal. The warden stopped before a pair of mahogany doors that looked entirely out of place in a house of concrete and steel. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and pushed them open. I took my first step into the lion's den, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, knowing that the man waiting inside held the only key to a door the law had already locked and bolted. As the doors shut behind me, the cold wind of the prison corridors was replaced by the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent, judging gaze of a man who dealt in a different kind of justice. The transition from the sterile, fluorescent glare of the prison hall to the interior of the warden's private office felt like stepping through a tear in the fabric of reality. Here, the air was dense, heavy with the aroma of aged cedar and the faint, sharp tang of expensive bourbon, scents that belonged to boardrooms and penthouses, not a death row annex. The room was bathed in a low, amber glow, shielded from the harsh morning sun by heavy velvet curtains that seemed to swallow all sound. At the center of this sanctuary of shadows stood a massive wooden desk, its surface polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the grim tableau before it. I stood in the center of the rug, a stark, jarring blot of orange against the deep mahoganies and burgundies of the room. My hands were pulled tight in front of me by the cold bite of the restraints, and I could feel the dampness of my own tears beginning to itch as they dried on my cheeks. Behind the desk, Willie L. Ford leaned forward, his hands clasped over a leather-bound blotter. He was an older man, his presence defined by a terrifying, still gravity. His dark suit was immaculate, his gray hair combed back with a precision that mirrored his reputation, and his eyes, calculating and ancient, tracked my every shiver. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a judge who had already passed sentence long before I walked through the door. To his left and right, two men stood like granite pillars. They were tall, their muscular frames filling out dark suits that did little to hide the lethality they carried in their posture. Their expressions were unreadable, their gazes fixed on me with a clinical detachment that made me feel less like a human being and more like a problem waiting to be disposed of. They were the enforcers of a kingdom that operated on a logic far older than the statutes that had put me in this jumpsuit. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the muffled, distant sound of a gate clanking somewhere in the facility, a reminder that the world outside was still counting down my final minutes. Ford's silence was a weapon, a deliberate weight intended to crush the spirit of anyone who stood where I was standing. He watched me intensely, his controlled expression betraying nothing of the shock the warden had described. I was a poor girl, a nobody from the streets of the North Side who had been chewed up and spat out by the system, and yet I had summoned him. The tension in the atmosphere was so thick it felt as though the very oxygen had been replaced by a static charge. I swallowed hard, my throat raw, looking into the eyes of the man who held the city in his palm, realizing that in this dimly lit office, the law ended and something much more dangerous began. The heavy silence persisted, a suffocating pressure that seemed to tighten the handcuffs around my wrists. Willie L. Ford reached for a silver humidor on his desk, his movements slow and deliberate, as if I were already a ghost not worth acknowledging. He didn't look up as he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You have 42 minutes left to live, Carol," he said, the coldness of the statement cutting deeper than any blade. "The warden thinks you've lost your mind. My men think you're a waste of their time. Give me one reason I shouldn't walk out that door and let the state finish what it started." He signaled to the bodyguards, a subtle tilt of his head that meant the audience was over. The man to my right stepped forward, his hand reaching for my elbow to drag me back to the gray reality of the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was the moment where the poor girl from the North Side was supposed to break, to beg, to scream for a mercy that wasn't coming. Instead, I planted my feet and leaned toward the desk, my voice a jagged shard of glass that sliced through the room's stillness. "The Blue Sparrow doesn't fly in winter, Willie." The bodyguard's hand froze inches from my arm. The room didn't just go silent. It went dead. Ford, who had been mid-motion reaching for a lighter, went perfectly still. His eyes, which had been bored and distant, snapped up to mine with a sudden predatory sharpness. The name, the code, was a relic of a ghost operation, a deep-cover ledger that had been buried 10 years ago, long before I was ever fitted for an orange jumpsuit. It was a secret that didn't belong to a common thief, and certainly not to a woman the papers called a low-life killer. Ford didn't move for a long beat, his gaze boring into me as if trying to see the wires behind my eyes. He slowly retracted his hand from the desk, his posture shifting from a disinterested judge to a man who had just found a snake in his bed. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice now a dangerous, quiet hiss. The bodyguards sensed the shift, their hands moving instinctively toward the lapels of their jackets, their unreadable expressions replaced by a sharp, lethal alertness. I didn't flinch. I let a single tear trail down my cheek, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, exhausting relief that the hook had set. "I didn't hear it," I whispered, stepping closer despite the guards' tensing frames. I lived it. I was the one who encoded the December manifest for the docs. I was the mole you thought you lost in the 4th Precinct fire. I saw the flicker of recognition, the slight widening of his pupils as the pieces of a decade-old puzzle began to rearrange themselves. I wasn't just a prisoner anymore. I was a living confession, and I was the only person in the room who knew that the man who had sent me to die was the same man currently holding Ford's ledger. Willie L. Ford stood up slowly, the heavy leather chair creaking behind him like a groan of disbelief. He walked around the edge of the desk, his presence expanding until it filled every corner of the shadowed room. He stopped only inches from me, his scent of tobacco and cold steel overpowering. He looked at me as if searching for a ghost in my eyes, his voice barely a breath. If you were the Blue Sparrow, the manifest died with you in that fire. The files were burned. The evidence was erased. There is nothing left but a dead girl's name. I felt the frantic pounding of my heart against my ribs, a reminder of the life that was currently being measured in grains of sand. I looked up at him, my voice trembling but certain. The files didn't burn, Willie. I knew the precinct was compromised. I knew the district attorney was coming for the ledger before the fire even started. I took a shallow, shaky breath, the weight of the secret I had carried for 7 years finally breaking the surface. I couldn't carry the microfilm out in my pocket. I couldn't hide it in a wall. So, I did the only thing that would ensure it stayed with me, no matter where they sent me. The bodyguards shifted, their brows furrowing in confusion, but Ford's eyes remained fixed on mine. He was a man who understood the lengths one would go to for survival. I lowered my head slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't lose the evidence, Willie. I swallowed it. A specialized, polymer-coated microcapsule. It's been inside me, dormant. Protected by a surgical mesh I had a back-alley doctor install in my abdominal wall years ago. A sharp, collective intake of breath hissed through the room. The warden, standing by the door, looked as if he might faint. It was a revelation that defied the logic of the prison system. They had searched my cell, my clothes, and my body 1,000 times, but they had never looked beneath the skin. I was a living vault, carrying the very proof that would dismantle the case against me and expose the rot in the prosecutor's office. The microfilm contains the original hit order. I continued, the words spilling out in a rush of desperate hope. It has the digital signature of the man who actually sanctioned the heist and the murder. It isn't your signature, Willie. It's his. The man who stood in that courtroom and called me a monster. The man who is currently waiting for the clock to hit 0, so his last mistake is buried in a potter's field. Ford reached out, his thumb and forefinger catching my chin, forcing me to look at him. For the first time, I didn't see judgment in his gaze. I saw a cold, calculated curiosity. He knew that if what I said was true, I wasn't just an inmate. I was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal, and the clock was still ticking. Ford's grip on my chin remained firm, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw as if trying to discern the truth through my very skin. The room felt smaller, the amber light of the lamps seeming to dim as the gravity of my words settled. You're claiming a man of the law, the man who spent 7 years making sure you never saw the sun again, is the one who did the job? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous hum. I leaned into his touch, my eyes searching his. John Harris didn't just secure my sentence, Willie. He scripted the entire tragedy. I took a breath, the memory of that night rushing back with the force of a physical blow. The heist at the socialite's estate wasn't about the jewelry. It was about a set of offshore account numbers she was threatening to turn over to the feds, accounts that belonged to Harris. He didn't send a professional because he couldn't risk the leak. He went himself. The bodyguards exchanged a sharp, wary glance, but Ford didn't look away. I continued, my voice gaining a desperate strength. I was there. I was the mole, remember? I was supposed to be the eyes inside, but I saw the one thing I wasn't meant to see. I watched from the shadows of the gallery as the district attorney of the city stood over that woman. He didn't just order the hit, he pulled the trigger. He killed her in a panic when the safe wouldn't open, and then he saw me. A shiver of genuine terror ran through me, as cold as the morning wind in the prison yard. He didn't kill me then because he realized a dead mole is just a body, but a living scapegoat is a closed case. He used his position to scrub the forensic evidence, to plant the weapon in my apartment, and to ensure that every witness who could have placed him at the scene disappeared or was bought off. He didn't just prosecute me, Willie. He executed a masterpiece of self-preservation. I looked at the clock on the wall. The hands were moving with a cruel, relentless precision. He's out there right now, likely sitting in a black SUV with tinted windows, waiting to watch me take my last breath so he can finally stop looking over his shoulder. He thinks that when I die, the truth dies with me. He has no idea that the evidence isn't in a file cabinet or a hard drive. It's been riding in my gut for 7 long years, waiting for this exact hour. Ford slowly withdrew his hand, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. The idea of a prosecutor playing his own game and winning at his expense was an insult he couldn't ignore. The atmosphere in the room shifted from interrogation to a war room, the air vibrating with a new, lethal intent. The air in the office grew colder, the amber light of the lamps flickering as if the very walls were trembling under the weight of my accusation. Willie L. Ford stood motionless, a predator weighing the value of a new truth. But as I finished describing Harris's presence at the scene, a sharp, sudden sound cut through the silence. A frantic, rhythmic tapping. I turned my head slightly, my eyes tracking the noise to the bodyguard standing on the left. His name was Elias. I remembered him from the old days, a man known for his stoic silence and iron nerves. But now, his composure was disintegrating. His hand, resting near the lapel of his tailored jacket, was twitching uncontrollably, his fingers drumming against the dark fabric. A bead of sweat had broken at his hairline, carving a glistening path down his temple despite the chill of the room. Ford didn't turn his head, but I saw his eyes shift in the reflection of the polished desk. He noticed the flinch. He noticed the way Elias's breathing had become shallow and ragged. In the world of Willie L. Ford, a flinch was a confession. Elias, Ford said, his voice a low, melodic threat that made the hair on my arms stand up. You were the one who handled the cleanup at the socialite's estate after the fire. You told me the scene was sterile. You told me the girl was the only loose end. The bodyguard didn't answer immediately. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat tight with terror. Boss, it was a chaotic night, he stammered, his voice losing its gravelly edge, turning thin and reedy. The fire department was crawling all over the place. I didn't see Harris. I swear, if he was there, he was already gone. He wasn't gone, I interjected, my voice a sharp strike against his lies. He was behind the curtain in the study. You didn't miss him, Elias. You spoke to him. I saw you hand him the casing from the first shot, the one that didn't hit the girl. You gave him the only piece of physical evidence that could have linked his personal sidearm to that room. The silence that followed was absolute. Elias's eyes darted toward the door, a split-second calculation of his chances of making it to the hallway. But the other bodyguard had already shifted his stance, his hand moving with lethal grace to the small of his back. Ford finally turned, his face a terrifying mask of disappointed power. He didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at the man who had been his shadow for a decade. John Harris didn't just buy a scapegoat, Ford whispered, the words carrying the weight of a death sentence. He bought my house. He bought my eyes. Elias opened his mouth to plead, but the words died in his throat. The betrayal was out in the light, naked and ugly. I looked at the clock, 28 minutes left. The internal rot of Ford's empire had been exposed, but the clock was still ticking for me, and the man who had paid for my silence was sitting just outside the prison gates, waiting for the needle to stop my heart. The heavy silence of the office was shattered by the shrill, persistent ringing of the wall-mounted telephone. Warden Miller jumped, his face turning a sickly shade of ash as he glanced at the clock. It was time. The protocol of the state of Ohio was a machine that, once set in motion, was designed to be unstoppable. It didn't care about internal betrayals or microcapsules hidden under skin. It only cared about the schedule. Warden, a voice crackled through the intercom on the desk. The witnesses are seated. The medical team is standing by. We are at T-minus 15 minutes. You need to escort the inmate back to the chamber immediately. Miller looked at Willie L. Ford, his eyes darting between the mafia boss and the trembling girl in the orange jumpsuit. I felt the floor drop out from under me. The adrenaline that had sustained me through my confession was replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. I had given them everything, the names, the codes, the location of the evidence, but the clock was faster than the truth. The guards outside the office door began to pound, their metallic knocks echoing like a hammer on a coffin lid. Miller, we have a schedule to keep. Open the door. Ford didn't move. He stood over Elias, who was now crumpled on the floor, his face buried in his hands. The second bodyguard had his weapon drawn, not aimed at me, but at the door. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a war room to a siege. I looked at my hands, still bound in steel, and realized that in a few minutes, these hands would be strapped to a gurney while a chemical cocktail ended my story before the final chapter could be written. Willie? I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time. They're going to kill me. He's out there right now, watching the door, waiting for you to walk out empty-handed. Ford finally turned his gaze away from his traitorous guard and looked at the warden. There was no panic in his eyes, only a terrifying, cold calculation. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a cell phone, a device that, by all prison regulations, shouldn't have existed within these walls. Miller, Ford said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. You have two choices. You can open that door and let those men take her, in which case I will ensure that every single secret I have on you and this facility is on the governor's desk within the hour. Or you can tell them there's a technical malfunction with the delivery system. You can give me 10 minutes. I can't stop the clock, Willie. It's automated. The governor is the only one. Then get him on the line, Ford interrupted, his thumb hovering over the dial. Outside, the shouting intensified. I could hear the sounds of heavy boots and the clattering of equipment being moved toward the chamber. The technical malfunction was a lie that wouldn't hold for long. The execution protocol was a ritual of precision, and any deviation would bring a swarm of state officials down on this office. I sank to my knees, the weight of the last 7 years finally crushing the breath from my lungs. I was so close. The truth was right here, inside me, but the world was determined to bury it. Willie L. Ford didn't wait for the warden's permission. He ignored the frantic pounding on the office door and the red light of the intercom that signaled the start of the final sequence. He moved with a glacial, terrifying calm, his thumb pressing a speed dial button on his encrypted phone. He held the device to his ear, his eyes locked onto mine, offering a silent promise that the world was about to bend or break. It's Willie, he said into the receiver. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a frequency that could stop a heart. I'm standing in Warden Miller's office. I'm looking at Carol Compo. You're going to stop the clock. On the other end of the line, I could hear a faint, agitated voice. The kind of voice that belonged to a man used to being the most powerful person in a room, now realizing he was merely a pawn on someone else's board. It was the governor's private line. Willie, you're asking for the impossible. The voice crackled, desperate and thin. The warrant is signed. The witnesses are in the gallery. The media is at the gates. If I stop this now without a legal basis, it's political suicide. You aren't listening? Ford replied, his tone shifting into something darker, a whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm informing you of a shift in the weather. I have the Blue Sparrow files. I have the evidence that your star district attorney, John Harris, used a state-sanctioned execution to bury his own homicide. If that needle touches her arm, the microfilm I'm holding goes to every major network and the Federal Bureau of Investigation simultaneously. You won't just lose an election. You'll lose your freedom. You'll be the man who presided over a state-sponsored murder to cover for a thief. The silence from the phone was deafening. Even the guards outside the door seemed to have gone quiet, as if the sheer force of Ford's will had permeated the wood. Warden Miller stood paralyzed, his gaze fixed on the mahogany doors, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. He knew that the hierarchy of the world had just inverted. The law was a set of rules for the common man, but the power Ford was wielding was a force of nature. "Give me the warden," the governor finally whispered, his voice defeated. Ford handed the phone to Miller. The warden's hand shook so violently he almost dropped the device. "Yes, Governor. Yes, sir. I understand. I'll announce a stay due to, yes, a technical malfunction in the delivery system. I'll clear the chamber." Miller hung up, his face drained of color, looking like a man who had seen the afterlife and found it empty. He turned to the intercom, his finger trembling as he pressed the button. "This is the warden. Abort the sequence. Repeat, abort the sequence. We have a catastrophic failure in the primary line. Clear the gallery and return the inmate to the holding area under my personal supervision. This is a direct order." I collapsed against the floor, the cold rug against my face, the only thing telling me I was still alive. The adrenaline that had kept me upright vanished, leaving me hollow and shaking. The clock had reached 0, but the world hadn't ended. Ford looked down at me, his expression unreadable as ever, but he didn't put the phone away. He turned his gaze toward the window, looking out toward the prison gates where a black SUV sat waiting. "The clock has stopped for you, Carol," Ford said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "But for John Harris, it's just started ticking." The heavy mahogany doors of the office swung open with a violent thud, not for the executioners, but for the tidal wave of justice that Willie L. Ford had just unleashed. The hallway, once a funnel toward death, was now a chaotic swarm of federal agents and state police who had descended upon the prison with the speed of a strike team. Word of the governor's emergency stay had rippled through the facility like an electric current, but it was the data Ford had transmitted that acted as the real detonator. Warden Miller stepped aside, his face a ghostly mask of ruin, as the sound of snapping plastic ties and the shouting of orders filled the administrative wing. I remained on the floor, my breath coming in shallow gasps, until I felt a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. It wasn't the rough grip of a prison guard. It was the hand of a federal marshal. With a sharp, metallic clack, the heavy steel restraints that had bitten into my wrists for years were finally unlocked. The weight of them falling to the rug was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I looked down at my hands, pale, trembling, and for the first time in 7 years, free. "Carol J. Compo?" the marshal asked, his voice steady and professional, yet carrying a hint of the gravity the situation deserved. "We have the files. We have the governor's order. You're coming with us." I was lifted to my feet, my legs feeling like water. As they led me toward the exit, we passed through the prison's main gate, emerging into the biting cold of the morning air. The scene in the courtyard was a spectacle of absolute collapse. The black SUV that had sat like a predatory shadow was now surrounded by white and blue cruisers, their sirens silent, but their lights painting the gray concrete walls in frantic pulses of red and blue. At the center of the storm stood John Harris. The district attorney, the man who had built his career on my bones, was no longer leaning casually against the hood of his vehicle. His expensive wool coat was rumpled, and his face, once so full of arrogant conviction, was a sickly, mottled gray. 2 agents were forced to pin his arms behind his back as they snapped heavy silver cuffs onto his wrists. He was screaming, something about his rights, something about a conspiracy, but his voice was drowned out by the sheer momentum of his downfall. Ford stood on the steps of the prison wing, his long dark coat billowing slightly in the wind, watching the arrest with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. As our eyes met, he didn't smile. He simply gave a single imperceptible nod. He had cleaned his house of Elias, and in doing so, he had burned down the house Harris had built for himself. As the agents guided me toward a waiting car, the reality finally shattered my shock. The corruption that had felt like an immovable mountain was being dismantled piece by piece. The media vans were already beginning to swarm at the outer gates, their long-range lenses catching the image of the poor girl, walking out of the shadows while the golden boy, was forced into the back of a police cruiser. For 7 years, the world had been upside down, but as the engine of the car hummed to life, I felt the horizon finally begin to level. I was no longer an inmate, no longer a scapegoat, and no longer invisible. The truth was out, and though it had traveled through the darkest channels of the city to get here, it had finally arrived. The heavy mahogany doors of the office swung open with a violent thud, not for the executioners, but for the tidal wave of justice that Willie L. Ford had just unleashed. The hallway, once a funnel toward death, was now a chaotic swarm of federal agents and state police who had descended upon the prison with the speed of a strike team. Word of the governor's emergency stay had rippled through the facility like an electric current, but it was the data Ford had transmitted that acted as the real detonator. Warden Miller stepped aside, his face a ghostly mask of ruin, as the sound of snapping plastic ties and the shouting of orders filled the administrative wing. I remained on the floor, my breath coming in shallow gasps, until I felt a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. It wasn't the rough grip of a prison guard. It was the hand of a federal marshal. With a sharp, metallic clack, the heavy steel restraints that had bitten into my wrists for years were finally unlocked. The weight of them falling to the rug was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I looked down at my hands, pale, trembling, and for the first time in 7 years, free. "Carol J. Compo?" the marshal asked, his voice steady and professional, yet carrying a hint of the gravity the situation deserved. "We have the files. We have the governor's order. You're coming with us." I was lifted to my feet, my legs feeling like water. As they led me toward the exit, we passed through the prison's main gate, emerging into the biting cold of the morning air. The scene in the courtyard was a spectacle of absolute collapse. The black SUV that had sat like a predatory shadow was now surrounded by white and blue cruisers, their sirens silent, but their lights painting the gray concrete walls in frantic pulses of red and blue. At the center of the storm stood John Harris. The district attorney, the man who had built his career on my bones, was no longer leaning casually against the hood of his vehicle. His expensive wool coat was rumpled, and his face, once so full of arrogant conviction, was a sickly, mottled gray. 2 agents were forced to pin his arms behind his back as they snapped heavy silver cuffs onto his wrists. He was screaming, something about his rights, something about a conspiracy, but his voice was drowned out by the sheer momentum of his downfall. Ford stood on the steps of the prison wing, his long dark coat billowing slightly in the wind, watching the arrest with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. As our eyes met, he didn't smile. He simply gave a single, imperceptible nod. He had cleaned his house of Elias, and in doing so, he had burned down the house Harris had built for himself. As the agents guided me toward a waiting car, the reality finally shattered my shock. The corruption that had felt like an immovable mountain was being dismantled piece by piece. The media vans were already beginning to swarm at the outer gates, their long-range lenses catching the image of the poor girl, walking out of the shadows while the golden boy was forced into the back of a police cruiser. For 7 years, the world had been upside down, but as the engine of the car hummed to life, I felt the horizon finally begin to level. I was no longer an inmate, no longer a scapegoat, and no longer invisible. The truth was out, and though it had traveled through the darkest channels of the city to get here, it had finally arrived. The heavy iron gates of the prison didn't just open. They groaned, a slow, industrial sound that marked the end of a 7-year nightmare. I stepped onto the asphalt, the transition from the shadow of the concrete walls to the open air of the city, feeling like a physical weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I wasn't looking at the horizon through a mesh of barbed wire. The world was vast, loud, and blindingly bright. A few yards away, the chaos of the press was being held back by a line of state police, their cameras flashing like distant lightning as they scrambled to capture the image of the woman who had cheated the needle. But parked directly in front of the gate, cutting through the noise with a silent, terrifying elegance, was Willie L. Ford's car. It was a long, obsidian black limousine that seemed to pull the light into its depth. The door was already held open by the bodyguard who had remained loyal, his eyes fixed on the surrounding crowd with a warning glare. I walked toward the vehicle, my legs still shaky but my head held higher than it had been since the night of the fire. As I reached the door, I paused, looking back one last time at the gray towers that had almost become my tomb. I thought of the poor girl who had entered those gates. A mole with nothing but a secret and a prayer. I was leaving that girl behind in the cell. I slid into the back of the car, the plush leather and the cool, climate-controlled air a sensory shock after years of cold stone and industrial disinfectant. Willie L. Ford sat in the corner, his silhouette etched against the tinted glass. He didn't offer a celebratory smile or a handshake. He simply watched me with that same ancient, calculating gaze as the car began to glide away from the curb, leaving the sirens and the shouting far behind. "The state will offer you a settlement," Ford said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that matched the hum of the engine. "The papers will call you a hero for a week. The governor will pretend he was always on your side. But the streets, Carol, the streets have a longer memory." He reached into a side compartment and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside sat a heavy gold ring, embossed with the seal of the Blue Sparrow, a symbol of the life I had once lived in the shadows, now reclaimed and refined. "John Harris thought he could bury the truth because he thought you were nothing," Ford continued, his eyes reflecting the passing city lights. "He forgot that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one held by a man in a suit, but the one held by the person who has lost everything and still refuses to blink." He handed me the box, and as I took it, I felt the shift. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a woman who had summoned a king and survived the encounter. I was the one who had dismantled a district attorney with a secret carried under my skin. I looked out the window as we turned onto the main boulevard, the city skyline rising up to meet us like a throne. The poor girl was dead, and the woman who had taken her place was no longer a victim of the city's darkness. She was its new architect. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice coming through the intercom. I looked at Ford, then back at the city that had tried to break me. I slipped the ring onto my finger, the gold cool and heavy. "Everywhere," I said. The car sped up, merging into the heart of the city, disappearing into the night where the real power lived. The executioner's clock had stopped, but for the first time in my life, I was finally the one holding the watch.